Welcome. Today we're going to be examining a Canadian criminal case that is um, incredibly complex and frankly very difficult to talk about.
It is. It's a story that starts with an absolutely terrible tragedy in Newfoundland and Labrador.
But it ends with a landmark legal ruling that really redefined the limits of police power across the entire country.
Our focus today is on the heartbreaking deaths of two 3-year-old twin girls, Karen and Krista Hart, back in 2002.
And while we have to keep that profound loss at the center of this, our analysis is really going to be on the legal architecture that was built around this case.
That's right. The police investigation, the highly controversial methods they used, and the huge legal questions that came out of it. Questions that went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada.
So our mission, really, is to understand how Nelson Hart, the girl's father, who was convicted of their murder, ultimately had that conviction thrown out by the nation's highest court.
And this ruling, it set completely new rules for police investigations, specifically targeting one of their most effective, but also most ethically complicated tools.
The Mr. Big Sting operation. It's this classic conflict, isn't it?
Sure.
The states need to solve these horrific crimes versus the constitutional rights of the person they're accusing.
It is. But before we get into the dense legal details, it's so important that we pause.
Absolutely.
We have to acknowledge the devastating tragedy at the core of this. The lives of two very young girls, Karen and Krista, were lost. And we have to remain sensitive to that immense grief as we dissect everything that came after.
Okay, so let's unpack the circumstances. Let's start with the Hart family in Gander, Newfoundland.
Nelson Hart was born in 1968. He lived there with his wife, Jennifer, and their twin daughters. And to really get the full picture, you have to understand how his relationship with his wife even began.
It wasn't a typical relationship, was it?
Not at all. It speaks directly to his vulnerabilities. Jennifer was originally hired to be his home care worker.
A home care worker. Why?
Because he had a medical diagnosis of epilepsy, she was there to assist him. And that caregiver-patient dynamic, it evolved into a marriage. And they had the twins.
So right from the start, there's this element of dependency.
Yes. And that was layered on top of just profound instability. The source material is very clear about this.
Chronic financial problems.
Severe chronic problems. They were heavily dependent on social assistance, and the poverty was so bad that at certain points they appeared to be homeless.
And that kind of constant economic stress, it's a crucial baseline for understanding everything that happens later.
It really is. It's the foundation of the whole coercion argument. And because they were so reliant on the state, they were also under intense scrutiny.
From social services.
Right. It got so concerning that social workers were actively considering taking the children away from the home.
That's a massive step.
A huge intervention. But the family managed to stop it, at least temporarily. They found lodging. They moved in with Jennifer's father. And that was just enough to satisfy the minimum requirements to keep the family together.
But the scrutiny didn't end there.
No. In fact, it was formalized. Social services started making weekly visits to the home to monitor the situation.
And we actually have testimony from one of the social workers, which gives us a picture of the home right before the tragedy.
We do. Carolyn Char. She visited the Harts just 6 days before the girls drowned, and her testimony is critical.
Because it establishes what social services did and didn't see.
Exactly. She told the court she had concerns, she was worried about the living arrangement, and she noted that the girls seemed undisciplined. It suggests a very high-stress, maybe chaotic environment.
Where parental supervision might have been, let's say, strained.
Strained is a good word. But she made a really vital distinction.
About abuse.
Absolutely. She stated very explicitly that despite all her other concerns, she did not have concerns about physical abuse.
So in the eyes of the professionals monitoring them, the risk was neglect, not physical harm.
Correct. Neglect or poor supervision within a context of just extreme poverty.
And Nelson Hart was not handling this constant weekly scrutiny well.
No, he was becoming more and more resistant. Shard testified that he complained very strongly about how often they were visiting. He felt like he was being constantly watched by the state.
This feeling of being monitored.
And it boiled over. She recalled one incident where he just refused to speak to a social worker. And to show his displeasure, he just started throwing dishes into the sink. Violently.
That's not a minor detail.
Not at all. It illustrates this deep frustration he felt. This sense of powerlessness over his own life because of his poverty and the state intrusion that came with it. It really sets the stage for a person who feels like they have no control.
And all this pressure, this simmering frustration, it all came to a head on August 4, 2002.
It did. And ironically, the family was getting ready for what should have been a nice community event. It was Gander Day, a local holiday.
But the tragedy happened during those preparations.
Hart drove Karen and Krista to Little Harbor on Gander Lake. Jennifer stayed behind to shower, so the girls were solely in his care.
And that's where they drowned.
That's where they drowned. And the investigation was immediately complicated by the first story Hart told the police.
The initial account was striking. Investigators must have seen red flags immediately.
I would think so. Hart claimed he saw his daughter Krista fall off the dock. Now here's the critical part. He says because he couldn't swim, his response was to get in his car and drive 10 kilometers back to Gander.
To get his wife for help.
To get his wife.
But she couldn't swim.
She also could not swim. So you can see why that would be an immediate problem for police. Why drive that far for that long to get someone who can't perform the rescue you need?
It makes no sense. What happened when they got back to the lake?
By the time they returned, Karen was found deceased in the water. Krista was found alive, but unconscious. She was rushed to the hospital, but she died there later.
The implausibility of that story must have put the focus squarely on him.
It did. And about 2 months later, under that intense pressure, he changed his story completely. He admitted he had lied.
And the new version.
The new version introduced a medical defense. He claimed he'd had an epileptic blackout, an epileptic seizure, right after he took the girls out of the car. And when he came to, he said Krista was already in the water.
So that moves it from, potential negligence or something worse to an uncontrollable medical event.
Exactly. It complicates things immensely for investigators.
But what was his reason for the first lie? The one about driving all the way back to Gander.
He said he lied to avoid losing his driver's license.
His driver's license?
Yes. His epilepsy was relevant to his driving privileges. If he admitted to having a seizure at the scene, he would have almost certainly had his license suspended.
And for a man in his situation, living in poverty, a license would be a lifeline.
It would be essential for mobility, for getting to services, for any chance at a job. So in his mind, it seems, the fear of losing that license was greater than the need to tell the truth about what happened to his daughters. It just shows this deep, deep fear of falling even further into poverty.
So by 2005, the police are basically stuck.
Completely stuck. They have no witnesses. They have a horrific outcome. And the only person who was there has given them 2 different self-serving stories.
The first one is a clear lie to protect his license, and the second is a medical alibi that's almost impossible to disprove.
It's the classic cold case scenario, and it's what led them to decide they needed an extraordinary measure.
This is where they decide to launch the Mr. Big sting operation.
Exactly. They weren't looking for physical evidence anymore. They were looking for a confession.
Let's really get into the mechanics of this Mr. Big tactic, because it's the hinge that the entire case turns on.
It is. The goal is to get a confession by creating this elaborate, fake reality where the suspect feels safe or even compelled to tell the truth to a supposed criminal boss.
So what is it exactly? It's more than just an undercover cop.
Oh, much more. It's a highly structured, long-term form of psychological manipulation. It's designed for these kinds of cold cases, usually murders, where all other avenues have failed.
So how did the RCMP start this with Nelson Hart? How do you introduce a fake criminal reality to someone in Gander?
The first step is always crucial. It has to be casual, non-threatening. They have to build trust.
So they don't come in talking about crime?
No, not at all. An undercover officer approached Hart in a parking lot, and the cover story was completely mundane. The officer convinced Hart to help him find his lost sister.
Just a favor.
Just a favor. It establishes a relationship based on helping someone out, not on crime.
But that's just the hook. It has to escalate from there, right?
It has to escalate, and it has to be built on tangible rewards. Hart started doing small favors for this new friend-easy tasks. And for each one, he'd get cash or maybe a gift.
And over time, the jobs get bigger.
And the payouts get bigger. He was slowly drawn in, made to believe he was now working for a very sophisticated, very wealthy criminal organization.
And for someone like Hart, who had lived his entire life in poverty.
That financial incentive was overwhelming. You have to imagine this is a man who's been on social assistance feeling powerless. Suddenly, he's being given a taste of money and freedom he's never, ever had.
The sources really emphasize that this was tailored to his specific economic vulnerability. It wasn't just about trust, it was about creating dependency.
That is such a crucial distinction. The RCMP didn't just offer him money, they offered him a whole new life.
A life with structure and respect.
Yes. For a man who felt constantly monitored and judged by social workers, this fake criminal group offered stability, status, and financial independence. He wasn't just being paid, he was being valued.
So his safety, his newfound status, it's all tied up with these new employers.
Completely dependent on them, and that dependency is what led to the first confession.
Which was triggered by a specific moment of, well, fake trust from the undercover officer.
It was. The lead officer did this sort of exchange of vulnerability. He confided in Hart. He told him about some terrible but fictional crimes from his own past.
An act of sharing secrets.
Exactly. It was designed to make Hart feel safe, to feel like he was with someone who understood. And after that calculated exchange, Hart verbally confessed to murdering Karen and Krista. He was mirroring the trust he thought he was being shown.
But a verbal confession to an undercover cop isn't always enough for court. They needed something more solid.
They needed it on tape. And they needed it under the most convincing circumstances possible. A meeting with the actual crime boss.
This was the final test.
The final high-stakes test. They told Hart that if he wanted to advance his blossoming criminal career, if he wanted to keep getting the money and the protection, he had to meet Mr. Big.
And to prove his worth to the boss, he had to come clean.
He had to tell the absolute truth about the murders. The RCMP videotaped the entire interaction, getting the direct, detailed confession they had spent months orchestrating.
And on that tape, he admitted it all, contradicting both his previous stories.
He did. He admitted to picking the girls up, carrying them to the dock, and throwing them in the water. He said he'd do it because he was frustrated by all the pressures in his life.
That sounds like a slam dunk for the prosecution.
It looked like one. But the defense argued that statement was nothing more than an act of submission.
He was just telling the boss what he wanted to hear.
That was the argument.
Yeah.
That he was so desperate to keep his new life, his cash flow, his acceptance in this group, that he would say anything. That it was a confession born of poverty, not of guilt.
So Nelson Hart goes to trial in 2007. The defense sticks to the epileptic seizure story and argues this confession was coerced.
They're essentially asking the jury to look past this graphic, tearful confession on the videotape and see the overwhelming, coercive environment it was made in.
They argued he was just desperate to impress these powerful men.
Exactly. That he wasn't confessing to a crime, he was trying to secure his job. The jury, however, didn't buy it. They accepted the confession, convicted him of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison.
But his legal team immediately starts the appeal. And this is where the whole focus shifts. It's no longer about what happened at the lake.
No, it becomes entirely about the conduct of the police. The core argument on appeal was that the confession itself should never have been allowed in court.
That it was inadmissible evidence.
Precisely. Because the combination of the manipulative nature of the sting and the huge financial inducements just exploited Hart's specific vulnerabilities to a point where the statement just couldn't be trusted.
And in 2012, the Newfoundland and Labrador Supreme Court of Appeal agreed with that.
They did. They tossed out the confession and ordered a new trial. But they also pointed out another big problem with the first trial.
Something about Hart's ability to testify.
Yes. And this is so important for understanding access to justice for vulnerable people.
Yeah.
The court found that Hart had effectively been denied his right to testify in his own defense.
Why?
Because of his epilepsy. He had severe public speaking anxiety, and the stress of testifying could, and often did, trigger his seizures. The court said he should have been accommodated.
Meaning he should have been allowed to testify in private or something like that.
Right, maybe via a video link. Something to lower the stress and give him a fair chance to tell his side of the story without risking a medical episode. It was another condemnation of the trial's fairness.
So the Crown, the prosecution, they appeal this decision to the Supreme Court of Canada.
They do, but the Supreme Court ultimately agrees with the appeal court. They upheld the ruling, and the confession was ruled inadmissible for good.
And that decision, R.V. Hart, in 2014, it changed Canadian law.
Fundamentally, the court didn't outlaw the Mr. Big tactic entirely. They recognized it can be useful, but they created a new, strict test for when a confession from one of these stings can be used.
The new threshold.
A new threshold. The Crown now has to prove that the confession's value as evidence outweighs its potential for prejudice.
And that balancing act is based on 3 major dangers the Supreme Court warned about. Let's go through them, starting with reliability.
Reliability is everything. The court recognized that the intense pressure of these stings creates a very real risk of a false confession.
Someone confessing to something they didn't do.
Yes. Hart was offered a lifeline out of poverty. If a suspect believes their entire future, their money, their safety, their social standing, depends on telling the boss a story that satisfies him, they might just do it. That's not a confession, it's economic coercion.
So it's not just about whether the confession sounds convincing on the tape.
No, it's about whether the circumstances make it inherently untrustworthy. The court has to look at the suspect's own vulnerabilities, their intelligence, their financial state, their mental health, and decide how easily they could be manipulated. For Hart, his poverty and his medical condition made him, in the eyes of the law, an unreliable confessor in that context.
Okay, so that's reliability. What was the second danger?
Prejudice. This goes right to the right to a fair trial.
How so?
Well, to make the Mr. Big Sting believable, the suspect has to participate in all these fake crimes along the way.
Like moving fake money or stolen goods.
Exactly. And when the jury sees hours of videotape of the accused acting like a criminal, talking like a criminal, it's incredibly prejudicial. It has nothing to do with the actual murder he's charged with, but it paints him as a bad person.
It contaminates the jury's view of him.
It creates an unfair prejudice. The jury starts thinking, well, if he's involved in all this other criminal stuff, he's probably the kind of person who could commit murder. And they stop focusing on the actual evidence for the crime he's on trial for. The Supreme Court said that severely compromises the right to a fair trial.
And the third danger they identified was police misconduct. A check on the power of the state.
It is. These operations are so manipulative and so expensive, the risk of investigators going too far is significant. The court said the tactics have to stay within reasonable bounds. They can't use threats of violence or exploitation or incentives that are so overwhelming they become abusive. It's about holding police accountable for their methods.
The reaction to this ruling from law enforcement must have been strong.
It was very critical. The undercover officer who ran the Harts' ding went public. He said he was still convinced Hart was guilty and that the Supreme Court's decision would cripple future investigations and make Canada less safe.
But for Nelson Hart, the legal outcome was clear. In 2014, the Crown announced they wouldn't try him again.
That's right. Without the confession, which was now inadmissible, they just didn't have enough evidence to have a reasonable prospect of conviction. The murder charges were withdrawn.
And after serving 9 years, Nelson Hart was released.
Yes. The system, in the end, prioritized the integrity of how the evidence was gathered over the confession itself.
But Hart's story doesn't end with his release on the murder charges. The source materials detail more legal troubles, this time from incidents that happened while he was in prison.
Right. In this part of the story, it really shifts the focus from, these big constitutional questions about police stings to issues of accountability and bias inside the correctional system.
He faced charges from a June 2013 incident.
Several charges. 4 counts of uttering threats to guards, 1 count of assault, and 1 count of mischief for damaging prison property.
The mischief charge was for smashing a television, wasn't it?
It was. There was surveillance video. It showed Hart getting very agitated, and he grabs a kettle and just smashes a TV with it. And that act of vandalism triggered an immediate physical response from the correctional staff.
And that response, the way he was restrained, became a key part of his trial.
It did. The video showed 3 officers initially restraining him, but then it escalated. 10 more officers entered his cell. They forced him to the floor, restrained him, and dragged him out. The defense used that footage to argue the response was completely disproportionate.
And Hart himself said he acted out on purpose to draw attention to his treatment.
That was his claim. He said he wanted the matter in court to expose how he was being treated. He said he felt like he was being treated like a dog. His mother, Pearl Hart, also spoke out publicly, saying he was being treated cruelly because of the notoriety of his murder case.
What was the outcome of that 2015 trial?
He was convicted of the threats and the mischief for the TV. He got a 60-day conditional sentence, which he served in the community since he was already out.
But there was another, even earlier incident from January 2013, something involving a paper plate.
Yes. This incident raised even more serious questions about procedure, this time by the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary, the RNC. Hart was accused of threatening and assaulting guards with a paper plate.
And his defense lawyer had a serious problem with how the police handled that.
A huge problem. The lawyer, Jeff Brace, argued that the RNC charged Hart based on nothing more than a single-paragraph, unsigned report from a correctional officer.
They didn't do their own investigation.
He alleged they didn't, that the constable filed charges without interviewing any of the officers involved or even looking at the video that was available, just rubber-stamping the prison's report.
The suggestion being that Hart was being targeted because of who he was.
That was the defense's argument, that there was an institutional bias against him. Brace claimed one specific guard was hell-bent on getting Hart on another charge.
It certainly raises questions about whether he was being punished through other means after the murder conviction was overturned.
It does. The outcome of that paper plate incident was mixed, though. The assault charge was eventually dismissed, but he was found guilty of uttering threats in relation to it. These minor charges really just highlight the incredibly difficult and combative relationship he had with the correctional system.
Which brings us back to the central, unsettling reality of this entire case. You have a man convicted of murdering his own children, a horrific crime. But that conviction is overturned.
And it's overturned not because of near evidence of his innocence, but because the method used to get the main piece of evidence, the confession, was deemed legally and ethically unsound. The question of his guilt is, in the eyes of the law, left unresolved.
The significance of the R.V. Hart decision for Canada's legal system is just. It's immense.
It can't be overstated. It was a powerful message that effective policing has to be connected to constitutional rights. The Supreme Court drew a clear line.
They defined the limits of state power.
They did. They confirmed that the state cannot use overwhelming financial and psychological pressure to exploit vulnerable people to the point that their free will is compromised and the evidence they produce is unreliable.
It's a critical protection. It forces investigators to be accountable for their methods. It's about that balance between solving crimes and protecting the rights of the individual.
And it forces us all to really grapple with what a truly voluntary statement is. When you look at those three flaws the Supreme Court pointed out, unreliability, prejudice, and police misconduct, it leaves you with a final, very provocative thought.
Which is?
How much weight should any legal system give to a confession when the person giving it sincerely believes that their immediate financial survival or their social acceptance in a group that has given them power for the first time depends entirely on them telling investigators what they want to hear? Is a confession that's born from desperation and poverty really a free confession at all?
It challenges the very idea of free will in the context of the justice system.
And it places the burden of proof right back where it should be, on the Crown, to present evidence that can stand up to scrutiny regardless of how emotionally powerful a confession might seem.
Thanks for listening.